Hey friends, tonight we'll walk right through the heart of Roanoke's lingering mystery. A hush lies over a low island of sand and pines. Tides move like slow breathing, and the cicadas sing as if they remember. Before we begin, please like and subscribe, only if this truly helps you unwind. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now lie back and get comfortable. Let's begin tonight's story. Hello, dear listener, and welcome to our tale of 400 years later. Roanoke's mystery still lives. Chapter 1. The Sand, the Sound, and the Word. The night wind comes soft across Albemarle and Pamlico sounds, and the reeds whisper along the margins of water that once carried shallow draft boats and wary hopes. The sand holds its dark coolness from the day pine needles scent the air, and somewhere a heron steps like a careful thought through the shallows. If you listen long enough, the island speaks in the oldest way by what it keeps, and by what it will not give back. Roanoke, a name that moves like a low tide across for centuries, steady, patient, refusing to rush. In the hush, the story begins gently, because almost everything here began gently on paper, in ink, in plans that were precise and hopeful. In 1584, a patent from Queen Elizabeth I gave Sir Walter Raleigh leave to plant an English colony in the New World. A place mapped mostly by imagination and a few bold coasts. The parchment crinkled, seals glowed red with wax, and the sea waited, calm only at a distance. We know this from royal records and letters, their script flowing like rivers across thick, cream pages. The kind of paper that keeps its silence but never forgets. By 1587, a small community of English men and women, about 115 souls, came to the quiet throat of Carolina's barrier islands. They were led by the painter-turned-governor John White, who had sketched fish and flowers with luminous care on earlier voyages. His watercolors, preserved now in London in patient light, still hold the curve of a leaf and the glimmer on a blue crab's back. They remind us that even the grandest ventures are carried by ordinary textures. A reed basket's weave, a gourd's smooth weight, the blue wash of a coastline seen from the water. In White's colors, you can almost feel the warm drag of summer air and hear the way pine bark roughens under the hand. The settlers chose Roanoke Island, not the mainland, not the deep rivers beyond. They raised timbers and palisades and stacked their hopes within, and so the Sound held a pocket of English voices beside Algonquian ones. Some nights the wind must have braided those words together. Elizabethan vowels and coastal Carolina consonants like cords pulled tight against weather. They named their babies, counted their stores, mended shoes, and learned the ways that corn ears whisper when they're ready to be picked. And in August, beneath the wide, hospital sky of summer, a child was born. Virginia Dare, first of her nation to open her eyes on this side of the ocean. In the hush, a cradle creaked, and someone hummed the shape of an old country, while the child knew only the present warmth of human breath. But provisions thinned, as provisions do in places that take longer to ripen to newcomers than maps suggest. And so, John White sailed back to England, promising the colony that he would return quickly with food, tools, and the tether of home. Across the Atlantic he went, just as Europe's own winds began to rise, the Spanish Armada gathering, the English mustering, the Channel filling with danger. The year 1588 overtook him, and then another, and in those seasons the palisade on Roanoke faced its own weather, its own hungry arithmetic. The sea is patient, but the stomach is not. When White finally returned in 1590, storms pushed at his ship, and storms pressed at his heart. The island was quiet. No welcome fires, no running children, no dogs barking at the unfurling sails. At the palisades gate, he found the word cut deep into the timber, Croatoan. The letters were clear, deliberate. Nearby, on a tree, another cut, Crow. He had told them once, if they were in distress, to carve a cross. There was no cross. He took the letters as a sign, a direction, Croatoan. The name of a people, the name of an island to the south, known now as Hatteras. The plan seemed simple. Sail there, follow the word like a lantern through the reeds. But the winds lifted, and the anchorage was treacherous, and the ship's ropes trembled under sudden strain. The captain, fearing wreck, turned away. The ocean is a stern negotiator. It rarely forgives a second mistake. And so the word remained, carved where the air could read it, a quiet, careful clue. The island kept its polite silence. Where did they go? The question began then, and I simply learned to live for centuries. Consider the island itself. A place of summer heat and green shadows, of mosquitoes that stitch the air with their small hunger, of water that slips everywhere. The land teaches the body to move slowly. Even the mystery moves slowly here. Drought, some say. Tree rings would speak later and tell of hard years, 1587 through 1589, when the rain travelled elsewhere and the corn waited in vain. The trees keep their diaries in thin lines, and researchers reading those wooden sentences have traced the thirsty summers. The settlers would have felt it in their tongues and in the grind of their mills, in the hollow sound of barrels and the tensile snap of dying stalks. Others point north, toward the wide rivers and the stories that wove around Jamestown years later. Tales of a people killed near the Chesapeake, of English survivors absorbed and then erased by conflict. Such stories burned across campfires, were carried by interpreters' breath, and were folded into reports that crossed the sea. Stories can be both true and bent by fear. They arrive like messages in tidewater bottles, real glass, real ink. And yet, the currents change the shoreline before anyone can be sure where the bottle began. And still others look south, to Croatoan Island, to the Hatteras banks where currents meet and break. There, in the sand, fragments of the everyday have sometimes surfaced. A shard of European pottery among native clay, a sliver of copper next to a shell bead. Archaeologists kneel beneath the sun, trowels in calm rhythms, brushing away centuries that accumulated like pine straw. Each small object is a word. Together they form a sentence whose grammar is time. Some sentences are incomplete. Some stop shy of a period and hum instead with ellipses. In the hush, let the island tell you one more thing. Mysteries often begin with ordinary days. Picture a late morning in 1587. The sky is clear. A bucket scrapes the well's throat. A woman lifts corn cakes from a hot stone and dusts her hands. A child traces a spiral in the sand with a stick and laughs at the tide unmaking it. Men check a weir for fish and find the silver flash good. Across the sound, the pines breathe out resin, and birds like slivers of light cross the canopy. Nothing shouts, and yet some decisions, like new paths through the brush, are made quietly. Perhaps a messenger from Croatoan arrives with news of better water and steadier food. Perhaps an arrangement blossoms in patient talk. Come when the moon is thin. Bring what you can carry, and live where the nets are fuller. In quiet places, kindness itself is a kind of evidence. When John White held the carved word in his hand, he must have felt both hope and distance. Hope that the promise they made no cross, if all is well, has been kept. Distance, because the sea had already decided what he could and could not do next. The ship pulled away, the island leaned back into its grasses, and the word weathered on in salt and sun. The palisades softened, pines reclaimed what men had squared. The sound went on with its slow breathing. Centuries later, the blueprints of their lives remain spread like thin light over the water. Church registers in England remember the names that crossed the ocean. A child's christening, a marriage near a market, an apprenticeship signed on a morning that smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. The British Museum keeps John White's plants and fish and the sketched faces of Algonquian people who looked back at him with their own histories, deep as the marsh and just as layered. The National Park Service tends the place where the myth so often tries to outrun the soil, and yet the soil keeps speaking in the same careful tongue. This is what was here. This is what the storm left. This is what a hand once touched. You might wonder whether the island wants to be solved. Some mysteries are not locked chests, but open windows that keep bringing in evening air. Theories come and go like tides. Spanish raids, storms, assimilation, and migration inland. Each theory stands in the reeds for a while, listening, making its case in a low voice. In recent decades, scientists carried tree cores out of the forest and read their narrow rings, and historians reread letters whose ink had paled to a grey whisper. Archaeologists sifted middens, where past meals keep the record that diaries sometimes forget. And so, the night gathers their work into a kind of chorus. Many notes, none shouting, all pointing to the ordinary ways that people choose to live near fresh water, near friends, near food, beneath the shelter of those who will teach them how to listen to a new land, in the soft drift before sleep. Imagine the settlers not as vanishing figures, but as neighbors folding into a coastline that knew more ways to endure than any one people did alone. Imagine a girl, not much older than Virginia Dare would have been, watching elders weave cordage and learning the knot by feel. Imagine a man repairing a fish trap with borrowed skill, grateful for the way thin twigs and strong hands can make supper out of a moving river. Imagine grief, too, because the world takes its portion in every century, but grief braided with practical mercy, the kind that builds boats and gardens rather than monuments. The mystery remains because it was never only a question of missing bodies. It is also a question of how memory chooses its stories. The colony that did not greet John White became the colony that would not answer us back, and so we carry their silence in our own words. Each generation asks again, and the island answers with its old patience. Look carefully, move slowly, and read what the sand keeps. There is time, dear listener. Time for chapters of drought and hope, of carved letters and uncarved crossings. Time to hear from rivers further inland and coasts further south. Time to listen to what Jamestown heard as rumor and what dendrochronology calls evidence. Time to follow a map's peeled patch and a shoreline's faint trail, to trace shards and copper, to weigh the breath of storms and the weight of hunger. The sound breathes in, the sound breathes out, and we drift with it. Not to solve at once, but to rest inside a question made of water, wind, and the human wish to belong. Beneath the lantern's quiet, the night recovers its soft edges, and the island returns to being what it has long been, a threshold. Tomorrow we will step further in and see what waits along the old paths. For now, close your eyes and let the pines hold their steady vigil. The word carved long ago glows just enough to mark the way forward, and the water, patient as always, keeps time. And so, the first thread is set. The needles are ready, the cloth still loose, begins to take a pattern. We will follow it, gently, in the chapters ahead. Chapter 2. Rivers that remember the first names. The tide turns slowly in the sounds, and so does the telling. To understand a word carved on a palisade, we drift back to the season when names were new here. When boats first shouldered through reed-lined creeks, and the water carried other syllables. Wanchis, Wenjina, Sekotan. The air tasted of salt and green things, of sweet gum and the pitch of fresh-cut pine. Nets dried over poles. Smoke rose in thin, straight threads from cooking fires and unrolled gently into the late afternoon sky. This was the summer grammar the English would try to learn, the patient syntax of a coast that asked only to be read slowly. In 1584, when the reconnoitering ships of Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow nosed into the Carolina Sounds under Rowley's commission, they found the low, bright world the Algonquian peoples already understood by heart. Villagers stood near the practical blessings of water and arable land. Corn leaves made their quiet applause when the wind crossed them, and fish moved in silver phrases beneath the surface. To the newcomers, these were the first gentle proofs, not gold, not sudden treasure, but the ordinary, abundant kind of wealth that sustains breakfast and evening and the simple gladness of enough. They took in the curve of the shores, the shoals that tease an inattentive keel, the broad flat water that can gleam like hammered tin in heat. And they learned that place names here were held in the mouth differently sung, almost shaped with care. From those first days of greeting, the story stretched across an ocean. Two men, Manteo of Croatoan and Wanchis of Roanoke, agreed to cross the water to England, to stand in rooms whose air smelled of wool and candle smoke and the sweet spice of foreign stores. In London, they would see streets paved with voices and hear a language that turned on different hinges. To Thomas Harriot, curious and methodical, they were not curiosities but bridges. He listened, he asked. He wrote a learned, patient book about the plants and the peoples and the plain facts of food, and how a leaf, dried and burned, could calm a restless mind. Beside him, John White washed the page with colour coats and hair, baskets and tobacco, the smooth, round bodies of squashes, the carved faces of dugout canoes that carried light across narrow water, as if it were just another kind of wood. When, in 1585, Sir Richard Grenville brought a larger company to test a foothold, the island saw English tents bloom like pale flowers along the margins of the Sound. Ralph Lane, soldier nervous and minded for fortifications, paced out angles and raised timber. Fort Raleigh took its beginning from straight lines and cautious hearts. The summer pressed down in its slow, hot way, and the visitors slept to a night chorus the forest sang without fail. But heat shortens tempers, and hunger tutors fear. There was friendship first, and courtesy. Feasts shared, fish traded, words exchanged, one careful leaf at a time, until they made a small woven mat of understanding. The English asked about copper and pearls, about furs and sweet resins. The Roanoke and Seckerton asked what sort of people leave such rooms behind to ride a water that never keeps still. Manteo moved between camps, stitching the talk into something that could hold. He wore, in English eyes, the dignity of the one who knows both shores. He would wear it, in truth, for the rest of his life. Yet stories sometimes grow thorns where they were smooth. A missing silver cup, small metal, small worth, but bright enough to catch suspicion, was demanded back from a village that had not taken it, and a punitive fire answered silence. Flames write fast, and they make poor translations. Wingina, whom the English called a king, watched the balance tilt. Old alliances along the Sounds were older than English maps. and Ralph Lane read those older lines as if they were new. Misreadings multiply quietly, like reeds. Food narrows a season. By late summer and fall, corn bins sounded hollow, and fish, sensitive to weather and moon, ran in skinnier silver. Lane's men looked past the palisade with a soldier's habit, measuring the distance between want and the ways to relieve it. There were raids for food and then regret, and there were letters written in the neat, careful hand of people who tried to make sense of the way a shoreline could receive and then resist them. The most familiar shape in their minds, the fort could not box water or wind or friendship. It could only hold a fear long enough for it to ripen. Then came storm and salvage, and one of those sideways turns the sea likes to take. Sir Francis Drake's fleet, harrying the Spanish and thundering through summer, stopped at Roanoke, heavy with supplies but also leaning into the edges of a hurricane. Drake offered help, a ship for exploration, a fortification of hope. The weather laughed softly in its throat and lifted the water. Masts swayed, cables sang under stress. In the end, Lane and his men took passage home. The island breathed out. The English left. In the hush that followed, the soil and water did what they always do. They steadied and remembered. Corn grew again. Nets came up rich or thin according to the moon's mood. Fireplaces murmured, children slept, and elders told the kind of stories that keep a coast well rooted. Where to set weirs, how to read a cloud bank, how to read the quiet face of a stranger. Manteo kept his crossings not only on boats, but on meanings. He had the rare gift of turning face and word without changing heart, and he guarded that gift with a gentleness the English would call loyalty, and his own people might have called sense. The next year, a tiny relief party, separated from Grenville, found the fort abandoned and left 15 men to hold the claim like a candle held cupped against the wind. 15 men are not many, and the sounds are wide. Their names blur now, the way footsteps blur on damp sand at dusk. They were a pause more than a chapter, and so the tide ran on toward 1587 and John White's company of families. The return was not a soldier's breadth this time, but a household's hope. Women with knowledge of herbs and boiling and small, sustaining breads. Men with sauset and adze, and the patience to repair. Children who would learn both the sweet and the bitter of a climate whose summer presses on the lungs. They were meant for Chesapeake country better harbors. Sweeter water, but the pilot, whether from pride or profit, set them ashore again on Roanoke. You can almost hear the settler's sigh mixed with the surf's. But a person can plant a life in many soils, if they are taught how to listen to the ground. They began again. We pause, in this evening's slow telling, by the rivers that hold those first names. Croatoan, Roanoke, Secaton. These are not only places, they are vessels for instruction. A river teaches the hand to cup differently. A marsh teaches the foot to test each step. A host teaches a guest the proper order of thanks and the gentle discipline of restraint. The English, trained by hedgerow and lane, by damp fields and hedged sheep, had to learn what a barrier island demands. To move with wind, not against it. To fix less and watch more. To take a new name as an honor, not a theft. Thomas Heriot wrote, in that limpid style of the scholar who loves his list, of beans that grow on trailing vines, of maize whose ears fill the hands, of roots that anchor hunger through winter. He wrote of towns arranged around open places, of fishing by fire at night when the water can be read by light, and of tobacco, that leaf of soothed nerves and slowed thought. He wrote of ceremonies and gods, and though he carried his English faith, he did not sneer at the logic of another. In his pages, a listener can still hear the respectful tap of a pen lifted when a thought is not yet sure. John White painted, and the paint does a quiet, holy work. In the glance of a woman balancing a pot, there is both ease and attention. In the line of a canoe's bow, there is tenderness for wood. In the body paint and woven sashes, there is an ethic of the beautiful that does not separate usefulness from grace. These were not curios to him. They were a grammar of living well. All this is prologued to a carved word, because all mysteries are rooted in the ordinary. A lost colony is first a lived colony, its mornings, its meals, its friendships, its errors, its slow learning. They watched the sun climb, noted the wind's new edge in October, and wondered if winter here had teeth as sharp as the winters at home. They asked questions that could be answered in a single afternoon. How to twist the river grass into a stronger chord, and ones that would take seasons. How to belong without erasing those who already did. And beneath the lantern's quiet, we return again to Manteo, who wore a cloak of meanings. He had sailed to cities that smelled of wet stone after rain, had stood inside rooms where glass trapped light like a lake, had bowed in a queen's chamber. He had walked again the pine-shadowed paths of home, and his feet knew both rhythms. When the English named him Lord of Roanoke and Daisy Munkapuk, they heard the English music of lordship. Manteo heard perhaps the older melody, responsibility braided with kinship. In the story that follows, his footsteps will glimmer at the edges, a steady kindness against the shifts of storm and rumour. For now, listen to the rivers. They keep the first names and the first missteps. They remember a silver cup and a burning house. They remember the first tobacco ember shared between new friends at the end of a day that had gone well. They remember the way a child's laugh sounds the same in any language when a fish flashes in a basket. They remember how an island can be a threshold and a teacher at once. Tomorrow, we will move with John White along the narrow creeks and out toward the open sea, and we will feel the tug of Europe's storms on a plan that needed a gentler calendar. We will watch a map gather a secret under a pasted patch. We will step into the fall of 1590 and see how a carved word can be both a lantern and a silence. But tonight, we lie near the first fires and let old names warm the air. The water, patient as ever, brings back everything it can, echoes of oars, the slide of a canoe, and the murmur of a language learned by listening. Rest now. The banks breathe out their resin and their wisdom, and the night folds itself like a careful letter. The seals are not yet broken, the ink is still drying, and somewhere the cornfields, raised on mounds and tended by practiced hands, listen to crickets and wait for the first blue light of morning. Chapter 3. The Map with the Quiet Patch. Morning comes slowly to barrier islands, as if the sun must first test each reed and ripple for consent. Light gathers on the skeletal arms of live oaks and on the tan, wind-written faces of the dunes, then slips across the sounds in a long, patient sheen. In that kind of light, paper glows, and so we begin with paper, the kind John White carried in a roll, the kind he laid flat with careful hands, the kind that takes a pencil's whisper and keeps it faithfully for centuries. Before the patch, before the word cut on timber, there were the small, human measures of hope that made a settlement. In August of 1587, the air heavy and sweet, a baby was born and given a name that folded geography into belonging, Virginia. The child's breath lifted and fell beside the soft rustle of corn leaves, and someone, perhaps her mother, perhaps an older woman whose hands knew the warmth and weight of newborns, sang a tune too old to have a composer. The camp was not rich, but it was attentive. Men mended nets, women counted and recounted stores. A boy ran to the edge of the palisade to watch a blue heron gather its legs into flight. Every beginning is a stitching of such threads. Then the arithmetic of need began to press. Barrels told their hollow truth. The shallows, once busy with silver, grew quieter, and White, who could draw the bend of a leaf as tenderly as if it were a child's cheek, knew what numbers do when they are not fed. He made the promise many leaders make, because there is no other honest one. I will return quickly with what you need. The sea, busy with its own wars, had other plans. In England, the summer of 1588 swelled with the Spanish armadas, dark timber and bright flags. And men who might have carried flour and rope, instead carried powder and shot. Sails that might have leaned toward the west squared up to the Channel's anxious winds. White waited, then waited again, and the days he counted were also counted by others under trees whose shade was not merely restful but necessary. The island across the ocean kept time with pine, resin, and patient tides. The Atlantic kept time with storms. At last, in 1590, he came back, ship's timbers creaking with salt and hope. Imagine the sighting of that narrow strip of land after such delay, the way the heart tries to set its own drumbeat under the clap of waves. The late summer wind had a sharpness at its edge, the kind that warns of a season's turn even as the days still blaze. The boat scraped into shallow water. Boots found the old sand. The path to the palisade was where it had always been, because people choose sensible places to walk, and even absence, they have habits. No voices, no smoke. The gate stood, and on it, a word grown from the alphabet into a signpost. Croatoan. The letters were not hurried. They bore the self-possession of a message that believes it will be read. On a nearby tree, the shorter fragment, Crow, White, had once asked his people to carve a cross if they departed in distress. There was no cross. The air around the letters felt oddly kind, like a hand placed gently on the shoulder of a man braced for sharper news. He moved through what had been lives. Gardens were roughened by neglect rather than violence, as if hands had simply moved away from them. Houses had been taken down methodically, timbers stacked or removed, nails not scattered but gathered. Something in the orderliness breathed reassurance. This had not been a flight in terror. This had been a decision. White's eye, trained to see structure in leaves and the right tilt of a fish's dorsal fin, would have read that order like a calm sentence. And yet the mouth still dries when a known room is emptied. Croatoan meant people. It also meant place. An island southward. Hatteras, where currents braid and the surf stitches white hem after white hem along an outer edge. White made the only plan a man could make when the sea is close and the day is narrowing. Sail there and look for faces he loved, the anchorage argued. Wind lifted out of its earlier languor and found teeth. Cables strummed and then protested. The captain, minding his ship's life as well as the men upon it, chose deep water over a shoal's temptation. The coast that can be so tender to canoe and paddler can turn iron to splinters for a ship mistimed by hours. They bore away. The word on the palisade kept its modest glow, a lamp left in a window a guest cannot yet reach. We follow White home, because the telling follows him even when his feet cannot follow the letters. There is a certain ache to maps that carry more hope than ground truth. Years earlier, he had traced rivers that curled like sentences to inland places, had marked villages with neat symbols, and had coloured the margins with the soft strength of watercolour, blue and green. On one of those sheets, its surface smooth as a held breath, he had laid a small patch, a neat piece glued over something he wished to change or reconsider. Centuries later, in a London room where light comes thin and polite through old panes. Careful hands would lift that patch and find beneath it a symbol, a tiny fort shape placed inland along one of those rivers toward the old wet meek country. The patch is a quiet thing. It does not shout discovery. It only asks the patient to look twice. What does a covered symbol mean? Perhaps only maps, like people, revise themselves as they learn. Perhaps a plan had grown within White's mind, or within the discourse of those who managed such ventures. Not only the barrier island, but an inland place. A better harbour, sweeter water, a place the 1587 settlers were meant to reach, but never did. Or perhaps the patch says something even simpler and kinder. That options existed, that contingency lived quietly in the folds of paper as it lives in the folds of a day. Under the pasted oval, the little geometry of defense sits like a kept secret. Secrets do not always mean deception. Sometimes they mean a promise deferred by the weather. Return, for a moment, to the palisade and to the letters newly carved. Croatoan. Think of the hand that cut them. Not a hasty knife, but a blade guided with care, every stroke pressed firmly enough to defy the salt winds sanding. Whoever carved them took time in a world where time had grown expensive, took time because someone else would come. Someone who knew to look for words. A message presumes a listener. The island's story is often told as abandonment. Sometimes it wishes to be told as communication. There is comfort in imagining the next steps that White's eye could not track. The community thinned by seasons, thickened by shared work, moving in small groups along the narrow beaches and through the maritime forest. Following guides whose feet read the ground as easily as a sailor reads a cloud bank. They would carry what could be carried. The iron that resists rot. The copper that catches sunlight like a small piece of day. Knives shaped to an English hand. They would leave what the forest could reabsorb, which is almost everything. Wattle and daub, straw, a shutter that would become a different kind of shelter for beetles and spiders. At night, under stars, the English named in Latin and their hosts named by weather. They would talk in a braided language of signs and patience. Children would sleep, because children sleep, where the adults' voices hold a steady cadence. The sea would tell its same story, and the mosquitoes would do their rude work, and dawn would be another chance to do the small, next right thing. Inland, the rivers bear different names. They tighten and twist, hemmed by trees whose roots grip the banks like old hands. Fresh water runs clearer in its shallows. Fish change their silver to bronze and back again depending on the light. Such places teach people to widen their vocabulary of shelter. The barrier island is a threshold and a watchman. The interior is a larder and a school. If the settlers moved toward either the southward island or the inland fork, they moved toward the logic of survival that already lived here in the daily, unromantic sense. Follow water, follow friendships, and follow the knowledge of those who are rooted. Centuries' worth of readers would come to White's map and its patched secret with a hunger for certainty. Some would bring magnifying glasses and spot lamps, instruments that pull truth like a thread from cloth. Others would bring stories they received from others. There are, after all, other papers later. More troubled, where Jamestown men reported rumor, where a captain's pen turned a tale of survivals into a crowd of shadows along a riverbank, where fear dressed itself in the garments of witness. The mind at ease in the city's stone lanes often trembles at the forest's fluent abundance. We do not scold them from our bed of listening. We only note that anxiety makes poor ink. There is, too, the long diary kept in wood. Drought rings, thin as a fingernail's crescent, lay tight in the heart of trees that stood here when the colonists made their plans. In those hard years, the sky withheld its ordinary mercy, and the ground replied with a hollow knock. If White's friends and kindred moved, they did not move from mystery to magic, but from thin water to thicker. To imagine them absorbed is not to commit them to invisibility. It is to honor their intelligence and the hospitality of those who had lived for generations with a coast that changes its mind as gently and constantly as breath. We return once more, quietly, to the feeling of paper. The map smooths beneath a palm to which the callus has returned after months at sea. Pencil touches down and lifts, the way a cautious foot tests a marshy path. The patched place, modest and oval, sits like a small moon over a mark that indicates intention, not proof in the courtroom sense, but proof in the human sense, that someone envisioned a way forward and drew it where a companion might someday find it. The night is friendly to such signs. It softens our insistence on conclusiveness and teaches us to rest inside the generosity of likely stories. Consider the craft of living that the colonists and their neighbors shared, and how such craft speaks across loss. A fish where is not a wall, it is an agreement with current and appetite. A garden mound is not a fence, it is a conversation with root and rain. A palisade can be both defense and scaffold, a place where a message carries better than it would on bare bark. The carved word was a weir for a later mind. Set in a current of conjecture, it slows the rush of fear and gathers the likely into a pool we can see. Evening deepens now along the sounds that remember everything. The tide turns under a sliver moon, and the pines speak in that low, unhurried way of old trees. White's ship is already a darker smudge, moving away, its wake braided by wind. On a far shore, southward or inland, other fires glow, not in crisis, but in the ordinary ritual of cooking and talking, the way a day's end ties itself to the next day's beginning. If you look from the right distance, the lights answer one another. The map in its roll keeps its small secret under a patch, and the patched secret keeps a candle in a window we cannot yet reach, but can still feel. We will go there in our next passage, following inland water like a sentence we have only begun to sound out, and listening for the old names that carry instruction. For tonight, let the quiet patch do its gentle work. Let it affirm the kindness at the heart of this long riddle, that messages were left, that plans were drawn, that people who wished to live did what people do. They chose relationship over pride, patience over noise, and a path that promised water, food, and hands that would show them how to hear the land. Rest, now. The paper cools under lamplight. The word on the gate warms under memory. Between them is a road of reeds and stars, and we will walk it by soft degrees, not to force a lock, but to open a window and breathe. Chapter 4. Shards in the sand, rings in the wood. Evening leans softly on the outer banks, and the surf writes the same pale sentence over and over along the rim of the world. Far back in the maritime forest, wind moves through pine and live oak with a patience learned from centuries. If you kneel at the line where dune gives way to scrub and brush the sand with your palm, you can sometimes feel how the island stores its memory, not in loud monuments, but in small, stubborn things that the tide forgets to steal. Shards first. They arrive in the hand like syllables. One is Sheltonburg native, where warm brown, smoothed by use, faintly scalloped where a thumb coaxed it into shape long ago. Another is something else, a thin porcelain flake with a glaze that refuses the grit. A brightness made in a kiln across an ocean. Archaeologists lay them side by side on a cloth spread over sand, and the cloth becomes, for a moment, a dictionary open to a page where two languages share a word. A copper scrap lies nearby, beaten to thinness by someone who learned the metal's temper without a guild, and it shines like a small piece of day that overslept into night. Southward from Roanoke, on the island once called Croatoan and later Hatteras, trowels have moved in slow rhythms at places where rumor and patience intersect. The work is tender, almost ceremonial. An inch down, brush, breathe, consider. Another inch, brush again. From such careful distances, fragments surface the everyday kind that resist legend, even as they speak to it. An iron aglet that once tipped a lace, a bit of green glass, a lead point that could have helped draw a straight line on paper that no longer exists. Beside them, the local clay that never left this coast, decorated with punctures and incisions like quiet music. Each fragment on its own is only a unit of texture. Together, they begin a sentence. People met here, traded here, shared skills and objects, and spent ordinary time. Nothing in a shard shouts. Shards do not solve, they gather. The island does not so much confess as hum. Inland, the story keeps a different key. Maps remember a secret fortified place under a patch, lifted centuries later. The land there is slower water, brown and generous, and the banks are hemmed with trees that hold their ground even when floods speak louder than they mean to. On certain ridges and knobs, places a practical heart would choose for a home when river mouths turn treacherous spades have found post holes. Stains of old palisades, a scatter of stone flakes from someone sharpening a life. In the soil, a bit of European pottery appears where only native clay should be. And then it is gone again for 10 feet of patient earth. And then another clue returns. The sentence remains unpunctuated, but not incoherent. If you listen closely, the wood speaks too. Rings thin as whispers in long buried trunks, and rings preserved in the cores of living cypresses. Record the summers of thirst that bracket the colony's brief known years. A dendrochronology's ears tuned to the metronome of slow growth reads the wooden diary. The late 1580s were hard. The rain withdrawn like a tired kindness, fields tightened. Creeks warmed to a sluggish clarity that fish disdained. Even people untroubled by a lack of imagination turn their faces toward places where the water is sweeter and steadier. The rings argue gently for movement as common sense, rather than mystery as spectacle. Along another corridor of time, letters from Jamestown carry rumors like seeds stuck to a traveler's cloak. In those reports, a chief speaks of a Chesapeake town, of strangers who came before and were unmade by later quarrels. Elsewhere, a man says he glimpsed grey eyes upstream. Elsewhere still, scribes note a tale of walled houses and carpenters' marks far from the coastal sand. The ink is neat, the handwriting sure, the certainty less so. When fear or policy leans on a pen, sentences wear a stiff coat. In the hush of the night, we set the papers down beside the shards, neither dismissing nor kneeling, and we ask the oldest questions. Who told this? For whom? And to what end? Stories of stones appear, too, inscribed rocks claiming to carry a mother's last words. They arrive much later, and they also arrive too perfectly to sit easily in the hand. Their letters are sharp where time should have softened them, their drama too ready-made for the appetite of the curious. Scholars weigh them and find them wanting, yet even doubtful objects teach caution. They remind us that longing for closure can turn a shoreline into a stage. We allow the stones to sit at the edge of our circle, admitted as cautionary guests rather than as witnesses. And then there is the living testimony that does not fit under glass. families along the sounds whose elders told a different kind of story, not in pamphlets, but around winter fires, that somewhere, long ago, light-skinned people folded into towns on the mainland and on the islands, and over seasons their children learned to point at fish the way the rivers taught, and to plant in mounds as the elders instructed, and to keep a few words from far-off shores as keepsakes in the mouth. Such traditions do not sign their names on vellum, but they do not evaporate either. They ride in song, in surname, in the easy pride with which a net is cast. When the night is gentle, we let such voices speak without forcing them to prove more than they promise. Consider how a household takes root when it is given the chance. A woman learns the local corn's calendar with her hands, pressing the soil when it warms, listening for the right sound in a dried ear. She pairs a European iron pot with a native clay cooking habit, discovering by doing that stew thickens differently when corn and beans share the same breath for hours. A man learns to read wind through reeds for the best day to check the weir, and he learns to mend with flexible twigs rather than with the nails he no longer wishes to spare. A child learns to say the names of fish twice, once in the word that crossed the ocean, once in the word that grew here from water. This is not disappearance. It is the kind of survival that craftsmen everywhere recognize. Adapt, adopt, and keep what is kind and workable. Let go of what the place will not bless. Back on Hatteras, where the breakers comb their slow white hair each afternoon, an archaeologist pauses after uncovering a copper eyelet and does what good field hands do at day's end. She looks up. Pelicans pass by, prehistoric and benevolent. The wind nudges the dune grass into a single soft direction. Behind her, a potsherd thumbed into shape by someone who did not know the word Europe catches the last light in its shallow curves. In front of her, the eyelet, foreign and familiar, at once throws a single clean glint. The two pieces do not argue. They rest in a small grammar of coexistence. Elsewhere, in a climate-controlled room, where pages breathe as if they are alive, a conservator smooths a map, bathes it in light that caresses rather than interrogates, and traces the outline of a covered mark revealed when a patch is lifted. The tiny fort icon inland is almost shy. It seems to say only this: at some moment, someone thought seriously about going, or about already being, there. We thank the mark for its restraint. Boldness is rarely how truth introduces itself. Our century has given the mystery machines of great kindness the means to see beneath sand without cutting it, to drink from tree rings without felling their keepers, to date charcoal to the narrowness of a decade, with ground-penetrating instruments, with patient sieves, with microscopes that love pollen the way a poet loves dust motes in a beam of sun. We have asked the coast more questions. It has answered in its usual way, with partial clarity, with generosity toward patience, with a quiet refusal to make a single gesture that would satisfy every appetite. The answers lean toward human common sense, toward absorption, seasonal moving, the pull of water and alliances, the slow stitching of lives. Lean closer now to the night itself, to what it asks of us as listeners. Not certainty, but charity. Not closure, but care. When we place a glazed shard and a shell-tempered one on the same cloth, we are practicing a kind of kindness, allowing that different hands reached for the same bowl, that hunger and cooking make kin faster than flags. When we read a Jamestown letter, we hold in mind both the writer's courage and his constraints, and we let neither cancel the other. When we consider people hosting newcomers through seasons, sweet and lean, we honor both the hospitality and the cost. Somewhere on a back shelf of time, the carved word still waits on its timber crotoan. It is less a riddle now and more a root, less a cry than a courtesy. It did not promise safety. It promised direction. That is already a great kindness in a world where tides shift their counsel every hour. The island that hosted the carving does what islands do. It receives, it schools, it sometimes refuses, it sometimes blesses. And those who left the carving took with them what matters most in hard seasons. The willingness to be taught anew in the hush. Imagine a late autumn meal in a village where native pots and a foreign spoon share a table laid close to the floor. Fish, roasted simply, flaky and giving. Corn pounded with beans into a soft kindness. A broth thickened by long simmer and talk. The room is warm with human breath and cooking smoke that chooses a patient path toward the rafters. A child asks for another piece of fish and receives it. No one is counting the miles to an absent harbor just then. They are counting the small mercies that make a winter possible. Tomorrow, if we move slowly, we may follow an inland river by memory, turning at the bend where Sweet Bay and Cypress lean together. We will listen for the echo of a hammer on a borrowed nail and for the older sound of a stone flake coaxed from a core. We will meet names that later ages tried to gather into a single tribe, a single story, though people always exceed the baskets into which we try to sort them. We will watch how kinship grows, not only from blood, but from work done side by side, from danger faced, shoulder to shoulder, from a joke told in one language that finds its answer in another. For now, ease back against the dune of your own pillow and let the sea keep counting its waves. The shards on the cloth wait, harmless as seeds. The rings in the wood hold their years like rosary beads for a patient prayer. The wind lays its palm on the crown of the pines and does not press, only blesses. And somewhere a trowel is set gently down for the night, its edge dulled by sand and made kinder thereby, ready to uncover in the morning not a secret to be shouted, but a small piece of the ordinary, exactly the sort of thing that, gathered with care, makes a life. Chapter 5. Where the tide becomes a road. Night arrives as a patient teacher on these coasts, and the tide, faithful as breath, draws a silver path across the sounds. If you stand quietly at the water's edge, you can see how the sea itself suggests a direction, how every falling wave points not only away, but also toward, as if saying softly, "Move with me and you will find what you can carry." In such light, choices ripen. In such light, the old question unclenches a little, and the story opens its palm to show not a single answer but a way of travelling between them. Think of the small moves first, the ones a household makes when the season thins. A door is lifted from its hinges and lashed across a sled of branches. A bundle is wound with a cord made of rivergrass, then shouldered with a grunt that is half effort, half relief. The iron thing's knife, awl, a hook, a clasp are wrapped in a piece of worn cloth and tucked where knock and rust will not find them quickly. A pot is chosen with care. Clay, if it is native and well-fired, holds the kind of knowledge that does not clamour. A child is given a smooth shell to carry because a hand that holds wonder does not reach so quickly for fear. Guides wait at the edge of pines. They do not lecture. They point with their chins, or with two fingers held together like a slender fish, and the path presents itself from the dim. A notch in the dune, a darker run of shrubs, where the ground will be firm, a shimmer of still water that must be circled rather than cut. Words travel in both directions, braided slowly into meaning. When someone stumbles, another hand lifts. In the hush, gratitude learns to speak without fuss. On Croatoan, where the surf spends itself to a clean lace each afternoon, the welcome is practical. There is a patch of ground that drains well. There is a small rise where houses can be raised and not be shaken by every heavy rain. There are fish traps already set by those who know how the current rolls its shoulder around a bar. There is a rhythm to work here, and the newcomers can feel it in their bones. The day divides itself into nets, into firewood, into repair, into food, into the calm of a late talk. While the sky goes tender at the edges, listen to that talk and do not hurry it. In the first evenings, it is mostly pointing and demonstration. Hands answer questions that the mouth cannot yet form. A net's mesh must be the size of a thumb bent, just so. A weir's stakes must lean at an angle that listens to both tide and stubborn fish. A canoe must be weighted with more patience than timber. After a week, the newcomer's hands remember the moves. After a month, they also remember to laugh at a mistake before it draws blood. Laughter is one of the older technologies of survival. Inland, where the water sweetens and narrows, the work changes, but the kindness does not. The rivers ask for a different gait, and those who know the banks teach it without pride. Feet find the roots first, then the flat places that pretend to be safe. A knife learns to share duty with stone. A garden bed takes shape where the leaf mold smells rich, and the sun, trimmed by trees, comes in thin coins rather than a single hot plate. Children discover how the floor of the forest is made of 1,000 patient years, and how to press a finger into it without offense. They learn the language of berries, the way a scholar learns declensions slowly, with an ear for both sweetness and warning. You can picture, if you like, a day that begins with a small ceremony. Not a drum or chant, not anything that would stop the birds in their usual work. Only the brief silence of choosing to call a place home, spoken by standing and looking and letting the ribs soften so breath can go all the way in. A woman places her palm on the new garden's first mound and closes her eyes. She is not praying in words she would recognize as such, not in any catechism learned by a cold hearth in an old village, though the shape of it is near. She is promising to listen to what this soil says. The soil hears and withholds judgment. It has long practice to watch strangers turn into neighbors. Sometimes the old stories pass along the river as if the water itself were speaking. A man with a soldier's posture arrives from the north on a canoe that carries its own history in scars. He has heard from a cousin in a town for bends away that fair-haired children live near the Shards, that a woman with a foreign spoon stirs a stew the way his aunt does, that a man with a careful gaze mends a net with a patience that would otherwise go to fiddling with a book. He is not surprised any more at the way people cross into one another's living spaces. He nods to the practical truth and adjusts his mind to the new capacity of us. Elsewhere, rumors run a harder edge. In Jamestown halls, a pen scratches a sentence that makes men in fair-off rooms sit straighter. There is talk of white captives and of chiefs who boast of older triumphs, names bent by translation until they fit someone's policy. There are shadows of raids, of a settlement broken, of bodies that warmed a hungry winter. Perhaps some of it happened as the pen says. Perhaps more of it happened as water tells it. Slowly, with mercy that is busy rather than dramatic. The night invites us to lay the papers down and place beside them the objects that do not argue shards. Copper, a bead found where two traditions meet. Let the eye weigh both and learn to prefer what the hand can feel. There are, too, families who will one day say without strain that their grandmother's grandmother told them how pale strangers came, and then, after a season, were no longer strangers, how their names blurred gently into neighborhood, how a child with gray eyes and a quick laugh learned to climb the same live oak as his cousins, and fell once, and did not cry because the older boy didn't. These stories do not list dates, they list recipes. They list where the creek's mud is softest, and how to pull your foot free if you have stepped wrongly. They list where someone is buried in a place of honor, because a piece of iron went back and forth through many hands and always came home. On Hatteras, a woman with a trowel and a hat wide as a kindness speaks softly to the pit she is working, as good field workers do. She tells it what she hopes it will give, thanks it for what it has given, and promises not to ask for more than it wishes to share. In a shallow square, she lifts a bead as blue as a clear morning and sets it beside a piece of pottery impressed with the pattern of a cord. The two objects sit together without quarreling. In their silence is a grammar she trusts. Exchange, dependence, ordinary alliance, inland under a canopy. A man who reads trees the way others read ledgers holds a sliver of cypress up to a good light. The rings crowd together in the years that concern us. Dry, then drier, then a breath of mercy, then not much. He writes the numbers down without drama. He has learned that truth likes small script. Later, when someone asks, he will speak in that tone reserved for difficult kindnesses. Enough water to live if you move, not enough if you insist on holding the sand with a clenched fist. The map in London waits on its table, and the patch is already lifted in the careful hands of a conservator. The fort sign reveals itself as quiet as a pearl behind gauze. It does not leap. It almost prefers not to be noticed. In its reserve is a suggestion we have already felt in our bones. A plan lived alongside other plans, a possibility held like a seed in dry weather. Those who doubt will say a mere mark can bear no weight. Those who hurry will insist it answers everything. The night wiser asks only that we let it be one voice among many that sing toward the same refrain. Listen now for a sound large and low at the body's center. It is the sound of belonging arriving on foot, not as a fanatic on a horse, but as a friend with a basket. It smells like fish, just at perfection, and corn that has learned to give up its starch to tenderness. It looks like a child sleeping with an arm flung across a cousin's ribs, the two breathing, finding a shared tempo. It feels like the relief of a shoulder set briefly against your own when a heavy beam is lifted and placed where it will keep rain honest. There are losses, and we do not turn our heads from them. A fever comes with a turning moon and takes someone whose hands were needed. A storm comes early and draws a line of wreckage above where the old women say the water usually goes. A misunderstanding blooms hard between kin from different shores and takes an afternoon to talk down into sense. The cost is real, and so the work of remaining together must be real too. In such seasons, a carved word on a gate proves itself not a riddle but a courtesy. We went toward those who could hold us up. Come find us if you can, so the tide becomes a road. The same water that brought the newcomers brings the news of them to other towns and other banks. Their names change their coats without losing their core. A man who answers to an English syllable easily learns to turn his head when a softer sound calls him to supper. A woman whose mother wore wool learns to bind her hair the way the wind prefers here, and her scalp thanks her for it. A child learns 2 words for the same bird, and then learns that the bird does not care which word is used if the noticing is true. Time, which loves the faithful, blesses this ordinary weaving. A year carries itself into a second, and in the second year there is a harvest that tastes like relief. In the third year, Someone who had wanted to be a carpenter becomes one, with tools borrowed and taught into their hands. In the 4th year, the laugh of an infant returns to a house where it had been too long absent. There are ceremonies, small and perfect. The sharing of a pipe when the sky turns violet. The quiet agreement to repair a neighbor's roof while he tends to a mother who has gone slippery with age. The exchange of words that say, in neither language and in both, what matters is that we continue. Centuries later, we stand where the old sand keeps its counsel and feel how the road of tide still opens and closes with the moon. We have more machines and more books and more careful hands than anyone dared imagine when John White held his breath at a carved word. Yet the essential remains simple. Where water is sweet and food is honest and hospitality is not a performance but a practice, people endure. Where fear grows louder than the click of a fish spine freed by a skilled knife, stories stiffen into theatre and forget to feed the living. The coast prefers the first arrangement. Now let the room where you are lying take on the gentleness of a marsh at dusk. Let your breath find the long measure of the sounds. In this chapter's slow procession, we have not solved anything by force. We have watched roads reveal themselves. We have read paper and pottery, wood and rumor, river and wind, and we have chosen to believe that lives move toward what keeps them alive. The night approves that choice because it has seen it repeated in every century 1,000 quiet times. Tomorrow, we will slip one last time through the reeds and back to the palisade where a word still glows with its earnestness. And we will gather the story's threads without tightening them into a knot. We will honor the ones who sailed back and could not return, and the ones who stayed and learned a new grammar of home, and the ones who welcomed and taught because that is what rooted people do. For now, lie back and let the tide mark a road you need not walk tonight. The stars keep their patient points. The water keeps time. And somewhere, on a table in a quiet room, a map rests with a small revealed mark that feels less like a secret than a kindness deferred, until we are ready to accept it. Chapter 6. The Lantern and the Shore. Dawn gathers quietly over the sounds, a slow unrolling of pale silk across water that remembers every oar it has ever lifted. In that first, merciful light, the island's breath is steady, and the pines stand like old friends who refuse to hurry. We have come far together, you and I, across paper and sand, along rivers that keep their lessons, through rings of wood and fragments of clay. And now we stand again where the palisade once held its neat geometry against a changing world. The letters still live in the mind's grain, a word cut with care, a word that did not promise answers so much as a direction. Croatoan in the hush. It reads less like a riddle and more like a lantern set on a windowsill toward a dependable shore. We linger at the edge, where grass leans and the ground gives a little with each step. The tide is making its quiet argument for movement, as it always does, and the wind brings the faintest taste of salt and resin. If you place your palm flat against the present, you can almost feel the older timbers beneath it, the gait of feet that learned to carry more wisely, the brief pause before a message is carved where it will be found. Nothing dramatic breaks the morning. The light simply widens, and with it, understanding. The story has gathered many gentle witnesses. There is Thomas, Harriet, careful and curious, who measured beans and words with equal patience, writing in a clean hand about gardens and fish and the sense with which a coast arranges its towns. There is John White, who held watercolors up to the world until color admitted its secrets, shell beads, woven belts, the calm precision of a canoe's line, the gaze of a woman balanced between work and grace. There is the later patch on his map, lifted long after his hand had steadied its last brushstroke, revealing the shy outline of a plan kept like a seed in a difficult season. These are not loud testimonies, they are forms of attention. Attention is a kind of love. There are the trees, which did not know they were keeping a record until someone learned to read them. Their narrow rings speak of summers drawn tight, and of the kind, brief loosening that may have come too late for a harvest. They do not accuse, they do not perform. They only note, with the slow authority of living wood, that water left the sky and the ground asked for mercy. And there are the shards that rest in archaeologists' cloth-lined trays, the local clay that feels like the voice of this place, and the foreign glaze that caught light in another world before it learned to catch light here. Laid side by side, they do not quarrel. They speak a modest sentence in favor of proximity and exchange. There are letters from men whose boots wore different mud, who wrote from halls where policy and fear sat across the table from each other and pretended not to notice the resemblance in their eyes. Those letters have their uses. They draw lines across maps. They give names to whispers. They help us see how rumor arrives dressed in the colors a reader expects. But in the end, we place them gently beside things that have borne weather. If a tale cannot stand beside a shard of clay and a ring of wood and a copper strip burnished thin by many fingers, we ask it to lower its voice. Here, on this margin of sand and patient water, we allow ourselves one more generous imagining not to close the door, but to soften its hinges. The settlers have already set out, some southward toward Hatteras, where the surf writes an everlasting white script, and the fishways keep their steady arithmetic. Some inland, into the brown clarity of rivers that slow the mind into good decisions. They carry iron in small, precious amounts. They carry words in larger amounts, and learned one gesture at a time. They carry the recipes and habits that, over seasons, will braid with the recipes and habits of those who host them until what once felt borrowed becomes simply ours. On a certain evening, in a village that knows the moon by how the sound changes under its pull, a meal is shared. The pot is neither fully foreign nor fully local anymore. It is what happens when need and care work together. Corn and beans and fish make their quiet music, a generosity thickening the broth into comfort. A man who once measured time by bell and market now measures it by the angle of birds over reeds. A woman who once warmed her hand at a hearth that smoked up a stone chimney now warms it over a hearth that breathes through a wattle wall, and she prefers it. A child who once answered to a name spoken with a clipped English vowel now turns with the same quick smile to a softer syllable. And in his laughter, both names find a home. If you lean your head, you can hear other rooms. A conservator's studio in London, where a map lies unrolled under pale light, its patched crescent raised like the smallest of moons. A museum where White's colours are kept in measured brightness, and where visitors lean closer not to conquer, but to attend. A low building near the dunes where field notes are written in pencil after a day of brushing time from the edges of an object. A ranger's quiet talk to a handful of travellers at evening, explaining that mysteries are sometimes only lives that declined to hold still for us. Across oceans and years, the same lesson holds. Attend to the ordinary. It knows more than drama does. We have, of course, also walked briefly with the counterfeit that tries to attach itself to any good puzzle the convenient stone inscribed. With news to perfect for its time, the tale polished for parlours, far from the weather. We admit such things as reminders not to love closure more than we love truth. The coast has never loved a door slammed shut. It prefers doors left on the latch, welcoming a late friend, There is another witness we have kept near but have not named loudly because it does not like fanfare. Hospitality. The people of these sounds and rivers had the old knowledge of how to feed a stranger until his story softened into kinship. They knew how to teach by doing. Lay the weir here, fix the stake, so, bend the sapling with its own logic. They also knew how to set a boundary without raising their voice. Not all meetings went smoothly. Not all lessons were learned the first time. But the record in earth and useful things leans toward a patient abundance shared, not a spectacle of disaster. If that is our answer, it is an answer made of 1,000 small yeses. And so, back at the Palisade's ghost, we breathe and let the carved word do its gentle work one last time. It does not unlock a single door. It lights many porches. It does not report a crisis. It marks a path. It tells the story of a people who refused to vanish because vanishing is not what humans do when there is water, food, friendship, and a grammar of living available at hand. It tells of elders who saw far enough to invite, of newcomers who learned to listen, of children who learned to laugh in both languages and to forget, mercifully, which was supposed to be theirs. What then becomes of the mystery? It does not leave us. It simply changes its posture. It stops knocking for attention and takes a chair by the fire. It lets us rest. In its quieter shape, it blesses the ordinary, the way a tide blesses shorelines without speech. We turn to the shelf where the good books sit, Harriet's careful account, White's precise images, later pages from men like Strachey and Lawson, useful and flawed, the measured findings of modern hands reading wood and earth, and we stack them in a tower that hums softly instead of shouting. The tower does not close the matter. It holds it open at the right place. The lesson that abides is simple enough to carry in the pocket of sleep. People endure by reading a place as if it were a wise teacher, by revising their plans the way a map revises itself under a modest patch, by making kin through work and table, by leaving messages a friend can find, by refusing to make hunger into theatre. When we look for them today along the sounds, we are not peering into an emptiness. We are acknowledging a fullness that chose not to perform. That fullness lingers in surnames and stories, in crafts taught palm to palm, in the easy pride with which a net is mended against tomorrow's tide. Now the day is thinning again, and the water takes up its silver thread. Your breath has found the long measure of this coast, the in and the out, the give and the receive, until listening begins to feel like floating. We do not force an ending. We allow one to arrive as the light does, lightly. Somewhere south, on banks that have kept their quiet grammar for centuries. Somewhere inland, a cypress mirror holds the last coins of sun and then folds them gently into the dark. On an old table in a quiet room, the map rests, patched and patient. In a glass case, color holds. In the ground, cool and undemanding, a shard waits for the next kind hand. Close your eyes and let the island become a threshold again. Not between here and gone, but between knowing and the softer comfort of trust. Not all stories are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be lived in, to be revisited the way you revisit a porch at dusk, just to hear the night begin its work. If you ever stand where John White stood and listen for voices, you may hear only wind and water. That will be enough. The wind and water are repeating what was said long ago, only slower. We went where life welcomed us, and we learned the names for welcome. Rest now, dear listener. The lantern is lit, and the shore is sure. The word is carved where anyone with patience can read it. The coast will keep counting its waves. The people we have followed will keep speaking in the grammar of ordinary kindness, through gardens, through boats, through meals, through laughter that comes on time. In that faithful music, the mystery keeps its promise, which was never to astonish, but to endure, and so the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again, good night. Evening cooking fires lift their thin, familiar threads of smoke,